Hello, in this video I'll show you how to use PDFsharp. That is basically how to generate a PDF file from C# code from a C# built application. Now it is rather tricky, and even if this particular library it is tricky, but this is probably the only library that exists that actually works and works well, and it does have some more advanced features, and it is free. It is indeed free. Some of the paid ones are perhaps a bit more easier to use, but they are quite a bit expensive. So I'm showing you this one, and I have gone through several of them, and I think this one is a good one. So let's see how it works and how to make it work specifically in .NET 5. So right here we have an example of generated stuff of PDF, right? We have third line of text right here. I can highlight it. Then we have the first line of text, and as you can see, the first line isn't exactly the first one. And then in the bottom right here we have the third one, or rather the second one, as it says here. Now it will all make sense once we get to the code, and that is what we are going to do now. But before we get to look, and before we get to me explaining what this code actually does, we need to set it up. And that is kind of the difficult part. Now, if I go here to the console app, you can see we are on .NET 5, so it does indeed actually run on .NET 5. And if we go to Nuget packages, you'll need to install 3 things. You must install them because, first of all, you have PDFsharp, right? PDFsharp. Now, I don't get this error, but once you install PDFsharp, you will get this sort of warning, rather not an error, that it may not match with .NET 5 because it's sort of an older version, right? Older kind of framework and things like that, different kind of framework rather. But it is possible to make it all match and to make it all work. And in order to make it all work and match, you'll need these 2 things. Common, right? System.drawing.common. And then finally, something a bit more secretive, something that's rather hidden, is this thing, system.text.encoding.codepages. Okay, these 3 things must be installed in order for this whole thing to work. Now the code pages will provide these, as it says, based encodings, right? Page-based encodings. So it provides this support, but it doesn't provide it simply by installing the library. There is one more thing to do. This is, by the way, a console application, a simple console application, right? And if I go to the top right here, you will see a few things going on. First of all, we have some using statements. We are using PDFsharp.drawing and PDFsharp.pdf. But before we begin using this, we will need to register something. We have system.text.encoding. This is a very useful thing. You have encoding, then you can choose UTF-8 or whatever it may be, and you can turn string to a byte array and byte array to a string. I made quite a few videos in some of my courses. You can see this being used in my network sockets course, which is quite an interesting course. So you learn TCP sockets, UDP sockets, and web sockets, how to implement them in C#. You'll see this being used, especially in web sockets. This is very useful. But in this case, we register a provider, and the provider, as you can see, comes from the code pages encoding provider, system.text. So this is basically what we installed, right? We installed it via the Nuget packages. So there's nothing fancy to you just register this package of encodings, basically, to put it bluntly, so to speak, right? We register this and we are good to go. If you do not, it will throw an error at the font. It will throw an error because it won't find the encoding, and it's not something you can easily troubleshoot. It is quite complex, so don't forget to register this thing and do all the Nuget packages. Now you can find this code at my Patreon. You can find pretty much all the source code you see on YouTube on the Patreon. You can download it quite easily and use it for your projects. Now, the way the PDF generator works. So let's get to that part. And later in this, we will get to another example, which is actually a list. So several pages, a list, something a bit more complex. Now, here we have PDF document, right? We establish a PDF document. And that document at some point will be saved. But it can't be an empty one, right? It's pointless to have an empty PDF document. So then we go to the next step, which is creating a new page. We need to create a PDF page. It comes from PDFsharp.pdf and then PDF page. Now the page is created in a similar way that you would create things in the Excel add-ins or PowerPoint add-ins, basically Microsoft Office add-ins. You create something with a method, it adds to the sort of parent object, if you will, and then it gives you the reference. And you deal with the reference and everything gets applied. There's no need to invoke another method or anything like that. It just sort of works with a reference. It's kind of important to remember that. And if you have worked with all these Office add-ins before, this will be quite familiar. If you haven't, you can actually learn that in one of my courses, Excel add-in courses, Word add-ins, and PowerPoint add-ins. So you can find them all in the description. Now we also have from PDF, okay, and that is xgraphics. Now GFX, this is a variable. If you go to the documentation, you'll find this same variable name used, and hopefully it will make your life easier referencing if you need to reference. So we have xgraphics. Now xgraphics is kind of like in HTML development, perhaps taking graphics from the canvas and using that stuff to draw. Basically this provides some methods that will do the drawing of things, drawing of text, drawing of lines, as you will later see, and you can actually add images as well. So whatever you need to add to your PDF, you can do that with this library. So we have this GFX, this xgraphics thing, and then we need a font. Now, font can be generated somewhere else, but you can set them up perhaps a bit more globally if you have some sort of more complex arrangement. So we have xfont, new xfont, and in this case we'll have just Arial, and we have 20, which is the size of font. Okay. Now, if we go further to the font, into the font, we have the xfont style. Let's see, xfont style. I'll just show you quickly, and this is basically bold, italic, regular. We will take a look at that in the next example. Okay, so we have this xfont created. Now the next thing we need to look at is this draw string. Now draw string could be called write text, because that is what it does. It will write the text into your PDF file. But it is rather complex, and the complex part is really in where it does it, right? Where will the text be drawn? So the first two examples here, the first line, okay, it will take, of course, the text, then it will take the font, which can actually be constructed right here. There's no need to do it in another line, but it depends on your preferences. Then you'll have xbrushes, right? Xbrushes, this is basically the color of your text. And then you have this thing called xrect, and it is actually xrect type, layout rectangle it is called, and that is basically the boundaries of where that text might actually go, where that text would align, okay? And then the next parameter is how it aligns. In this case, it will align in the center. And what we take here, this square, this rectangle, rather not square, this is the whole page, okay? This is the whole page. We are working with a reference of a page, and the reference sort of went into this GFX, this xgraphics thing, or rather it took the reference and it sort of applies to the reference. It doesn't really matter, all these technicalities. So, we have this draw string, and then another option, it's more or less the same, we just have a different color on the X brushes. We still use the whole page as a reference point. And then we have X string formats. This is bottom left. Now you probably remember, you saw it, it was sort of down at the bottom, and this kind of an arrangement would be very useful if you had a page number, for example, or if you had a date for each page. Now you would probably want to make it a smaller font size and all that, but it is your choice what you do with it. In the next example we will see a bit more of that perhaps. So the last one, and this is probably the one I would work with mostly, and that is sort of very free, very customizable option. We have here, of course, the text itself. Then we have the font, we use the same font once again. Then we have the color of a brush. And then we have this X point. We have this X point. Now, if you do things like that, this will be relative to the page. Specific, okay? This is specific margin. This is from the left, the X coordinate, if you will, and this is from the top. The second one is from the top, Y coordinate, you might call it, right? So we have from the left and from the top, X and Y, and this is where the text will be placed. Now, this will be very useful in the second example. You will see the list, you will see how to deal with more pages, and maybe at this point you don't need to see it anymore, so you can feel free to download the code and go on with your project. Now, the last thing is, of course, saving the document, otherwise it's all pointless. So in this case, I just save it to the computer, but you could actually save it, as you can see, to stream. You can save it to stream and to stream without closing the stream. So you do have that great option of saving it to stream and perhaps sending it to the internet, uploading somewhere or doing something of that nature. But these are the basics of it. And now let's take a look at another example at how you can make a list, deal with several pages and do sort of quite complex calculations on how everything gets displayed. So now let's jump into making a list, and let's see what the list will look like once it's generated. You can see right here we have a sort of title, if you will, users list. We have a little line to separate things, and then below that we start the table. Now this is a simple randomly generated users list. We have a model, we have a list, and from that list we actually create the whole arrangement. Now we have the first name, we have the last name, we have the date of birth. So kind of a varied arrangement of stuff. And if we look at how it all works, we have a bit of stuff, a few records in the first page, but then in the next pages, in the upcoming ones, we will have more records. Okay, so it's not the same amount of records in the first page as there will be in the upcoming ones. So you see this is a bit more, this is the same amount, and then the last one is a bit shorter because there's nothing left to insert. But as you can see, we are now working throughout several pages, and you can see, and you will see rather, how to generate all that. So let's go to the Visual Studio and let's see what's happening here. First of all, I have to show you the class right here. We have user, first name, last name, date of birth. This is the model, that's it. And then we have the list of users. Now obviously in the real world this will probably come from some database or from some API, and it will be generated into PDF that way. But let's go to the top. Let's go to the top now, and let's see where we start, where we begin, and we begin with register provider. Remember, we have to register this encoding, syncoding kind of an arrangement, formats and all that stuff. And then we have a little randomizer. We basically just generate the records, the users into that list. The last one is date of birth. It subtracts a random number of days from 10,000 to 20,000 and basically gives you a random age. Now, after that, we run generate PDF, and this is where the magic happens. So let's go into that. As you can see, in this case, we have the title of the document, and I kind of want to show you a bit about the info of the document and what's in there, what's in the actual document object, and what you can find. So if we go a bit into the document, you can see even without going into the whole thing, you can find stuff like file size, and then you can see some of these different things. Maybe not much to mess with hand. I would say try to avoid it if you can. Obviously you can use security settings and things like that, and if this goes well, maybe I'll make a few more videos explaining how to use some of these other options. But as you can see, you can actually add some stuff, sort of metadata, into the document. So it's not just generating stuff into the pages, you can actually deal with the PDF file to its fullest extent. Now, after that, we of course need the first page. We need the first page right here. And after that, we need to generate the GFX, the X graphics, this variable GFX. It does not have to be GFX, but this is the name they use in the documentation, and this is the name somehow that I got used to as well. So we have from PDF, from page, everything looks great. The first thing we have to do, we have to generate that header. Okay, I call it header, it should be probably a title, doesn't really matter. And it says users list, okay, and the font, as you can see, is constructed right into the parameter. There's no need to create another line of code. And in this case, we do Arial, but it's 40, so it's larger, and it is bold. And as you have seen, it is red. The brush is red. Now it is 200 from the left and 70 from the top. Below that, we have a little line, right? We have a little line. And to draw the line, we use draw the line. Quite obvious, right? We draw the line. Now, the method may be obvious, but how to do it is kind of tricky. So first of all, we have the pen color. You can generate that from ARBG. So in a real world application, we just go to Google and you would find some kind of a color picker, and then you get the colors from there. That's how I would do it, at least. I think this is the best way to go about it. Now the next thing is the starting point. Okay, the next parameter is the starting point. So this is these are the coordinates for the starting point of the line. Remember, a line has 2 points, where it starts and where it ends. Okay, that's how a line works. Basics of, I guess, geometry. So we have at 100 and 100, 100 from the left, 100 from the top. This is where the line will start. And it will be a straight line because you can see the y coordinate is the same, right? So it will go from left to right in a straight line. The only difference is that it will move on the x, moving to the right, and we have basically the length of 400 in this case. So it's not exactly from one side to the other, as you have seen. So let's go into generating the so-called table. Now, this isn't exactly a table, and this doesn't really provide that kind of a table-ish arrangement, and as I mentioned previously, this tool, this library, it does give you all the power to customize, but it doesn't really help you too much in terms of generating. It's not exactly plug and play. You have to work with it, you have to develop your algorithms to make things work, but it is completely open. You can do whatever you want to do. You can insert images, strings and lines and other shapes as well. In fact, I can go into the GFX And you can see right here, you can draw arcs, you can even draw a barcode, right? And you can do that. So lots of different options we have. Okay, now let's move on and let's see the table header. So the table header is the names for the columns. Okay, the names for the columns. If we go back just quickly to the top right here, you can see this is the header, the table header. And then we'll have one line before we start going into any loop. Okay, we do the first line in no loop, otherwise we would have to add some if statements and it will be annoying and pointless. Let's go back to the code. As you can see, we have drawString. We draw all of them, all of those things. We do Arial 15, black brush, and then we have some coordinates. Now, coordinates, you'll have to do some trial and error. There's no other way about it. But it's not too difficult to do. It is more difficult to do when you have to generate, and that's the next step. It can actually be quite time consuming. It won't perhaps give you too much of a headache, but you have to sort of be mindful of it and know that it will take some time to get things right, especially if you want them perfect. So you have draw line after that, and this will draw that first line. As you can see, we move, okay, we do it a bit differently than the first one. This one sort of closer to the left side and closer to the right side, a bit of a longer line this one is. And these are the coordinates for it. Now, these coordinates are quite important, okay. We have 290 here, okay, 290 here. And the next two variables is where we start generating things. We have current Y position values and current Y position line. Okay, now this may not make too much sense yet, but let's go down a bit and I'll show you why we need those two things. Okay, so basically these three, drawString is the row of records, right? It's the row of records. Once we insert the row of records, we draw the line to separate them from the next row of records. Okay? Now, we need to have a starting point for the values. They are all in the same line, right? They are all in the same line, so we're not, we don't have to change on every cycle the X value, but we do have to adjust the Y value, the Y position. And that is why we have current position values and then current position line. The reason these two are separated is because the line goes below the values. All the values are on the same, okay, are on the same line, on the same level, if you will, but the line goes below the values. Now, the difference, the initial difference from them, or the margin between them, we have 7, right? So the values are at 303 and the line is at 310. That is what we have. And on every new value, once we insert that, we move forward, or we move downwards rather in this case. So we add plus 20, plus 20, plus 20, plus 20 every time we do it. But you can see we have an if statement. The reason we have an if statement is because we can fit a certain amount of these rows into the first page, but we can only fit a certain amount which is lower than we can fit in the other pages. Now, if we did it in one loop for both options, it would be quite tricky. But this is a lot cleaner. We have one loop for when we have records, a number of records lower than it needs, than it would require 2 or more pages. Okay, so if it's 20 or less, we just put it into one page. If it's more than 20, we go into the else, right? And we go into the else and we use several pages. So let's see. Now in this case, the numbers don't really match, but basically what we do with this first loop right here is we fill up the first page. Okay, we just fill up the first page the same way you saw previously. We just fill it up like that, moving on, but we also remove. Now we remove the users because we'll run another loop to fill out the full pages that can contain the same amount of records, the same amount of rows. We will fill that up with another loop. Okay, but then how to advance, right? How to advance to another page? Well, this is where we see it right here. We have right here page. Now page was established way before all of this happened, right? Page was the first thing to be established. But at this point, we have filled the first page. So what we have to do is replace the page reference and therefore the GFX reference with the second page. And this, it's just quite simple, right? We just add a new reference to the same variable, and then we work with the second page. Now this should be actually removed. We don't need that, just so it doesn't confuse anything. And then you see we need to reset the values because these values are relevant to each page. They are not relevant to the whole file. They're relevant to each page. Okay, so then after that we go into another loop. Remember, all the first one so that were inserted, they were removed, so we can deal basically with a brand new fresh list. It's all looking great and perfect. Okay, we have the count, we have all that. And here, on every cycle, we will check if it hasn't reached 30 records for that particular page, because in this configuration, one page can only hold 30 records. If we have reached that number, we will reset the references and we will move forward to another page. Okay? See, we reset the position values, we reset the references, and we can move forward. Right here, we can move forward. Now, in the bottom, we save it to the file. So this is kind of a bit more complex. Now, you can find all of these, both of these rather, examples on my Patreon. You can also take a look at some of my courses in the description. You can learn Blazor. I also have this huge, sort of a slow-paced course where I type the code and I talk about it. But in that one, you'll learn Blazor, API development, how to deal with SQL Server with ADO.NET and Entity Framework Core, and then a bit of HTML and CSS as well. So sort of a full stack web development in a modern way course, and it's quite inexpensive at the moment. So do take a look at that in the description, or do take a look at some of the fast-paced course for Blazor, API development, as well as the TCP, UDP, and WebSockets development course. Now, with that said, do subscribe to this channel, and we will conclude this video.